One and all, welcome back to the Movie Pope podcast. And today we are doing another Shakespeare episode. Yes, I know you couldn't get enough of Colin David Reese when we had a five-part special about Shakespeare, and we're going to be doing more with our discussion of Shakespeare and his world and the Elizabethan England of the 16th century. But before we dive in, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and please share these videos with everybody that you know, because we are looking to grow our audience, and the more who know about this, the better. And really, we are looking to expand our episode topics to include many things, not just movie or arts related, but topics about politics and history and all that good stuff. Because you know what, I can have a life outside, outside of chatting about movies with the movie Pope. He doesn't own me, but don't tell him that. So today I've got Claire Lynch. Is it Claire, right?
It is, yes. Hello.
Claire. So I've got Claire here today, and we are going to chat about Tudor politics and how they influenced the one and only William Shakespeare. Claire, how are you doing
Hello.
on this fine? Well, here it's afternoon, but over there it's evening where you are. How are you
Yeah,
doing
it's
today?
I'm very well actually. It's been a nice, bit waterlogged at the moment. We've been unprecedented rain over where I am, so
Holy
yeah,
crap. It's funny you should say that because for the past 2 days here, it's been raining like cats and dogs. So,
it's been awful. It's been really bad. Just can't seem to get a break. So it's very
but,
bleak.
but to be
I feel I
fair,
feel I feel like I'm in the start of a Charles Dickens novel. It's just rain.
but to be fair,
What
you
was
are but to be fair, you are living in merry old England, and as we
That's
all
true.
know, Old Blighty is renowned for being a rainy rock in the middle of the North Sea, to quote Jeremy
That's
Clarkson.
very true. Very true.
I was waiting to pull that quote out, by the way.
Good for you. Good slotting in there.
So, so before we get started, Claire, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what your interest is in Shakespeare?
My name's Claire. I've been working. I work as an educator. I've been educating since 2006. Before then, I fell in love with Shakespeare. The first time I was always aware of him. My dad was really into Shakespeare. The first time I properly fell in love with him was when I saw. I know it's very problematic and people got their own opinions, but when I first saw the Kenneth Branagh version of Much Ado About Nothing.
Oh, they're gonna say Shakespeare in Love.
No, I enjoyed that one, but it was when I saw the Branagh version of Much Ado, and now I've explored it a bit more, and I know that some people love it and hate it, but to me it was something spectacular about it. And what I really liked was, and I still perpetuate to this day, that people have always said Shakespeare is for the intelligent people. And it's almost like, you go to those theme parks and they've got a sign that says you must be this high to ride.
Hmm.
And it's almost like that you must be this intellectual to understand and appreciate Shakespeare. And that's always stuck with me. And I'm thinking, no, you don't. What are you talking about? And it's been my mission to kind of smash that myth and push that Shakespeare is for the masses. And I remember seeing this film in the cinema, going, I understood that, but I thought that Shakespeare was not supposed to be understood by people like me, poor-brained me, and I understood it. And as I got more into it, I started coming to the conclusion that, yeah, I've been sold a lie here somewhere, or there's been a misnomer or a Mandela effect somewhere, that I thought Shakespeare was only for the intellectuals. And yes, it is clever. And yes, there are librarians with big beards and dusty books who've theorized and hypothesized and parenthesized and studied Shakespeare. And there is elements of intellectuality in his writing, absolutely. But at the deep heart of it, Shakespeare was an everyman for everyman. And I think some people need to realize or remember that fact, that it wasn't for very plummy actors being very serious on stage. It was for absolutely everybody. And Shakespeare was a Brummie. He was from Birmingham. He had a very thick uh, kind of Midland accent, which I think is wonderful. But there are people in the world who don't think it is classy, shall we say.
Yeah, and I was gonna say too, because when I did my interview with Colin a few months back, and I'll have a link for it down below. We we were chatting about the academic and the actor's approach to Shakespeare because
Mm,
because like you said, the actor is going to have one way of viewing Shakespeare because
mm,
they're approaching it from a performance standpoint, right? So
mm.
the way they understand and interpret you know the plays is going to be quite different from from an academic who is going to approach it from a much different paradigm. And
Absolutely.
and what I find so fascinating is the fact that these two views don't necessarily need to be at odds with each other, but but that's what you
No.
see. I mean, would you agree with
I
that
do, I
statement?
do, I do, and I think, um, I mean, I mean, I am going to declare my bias here because I fall down squarely on the actor's side of it, and my
Oh, I thought you were
reasoning
going to say the
is
academic side.
no, no, not at all. I mean that I approach it thus: is when Shakespeare started, what did Shakespeare start as? He started as an actor.
Right.
And I've always said, I've always maintained that Shakespeare is for the stage, not the page. And for example, I'm reading I'm in the south of England, and I'm aware of productions that go on around me, and I know that there's a production company on the Isle of Wight near me that do a lot of Shakespeare, and they've constantly said that you know if you think you understand Shakespeare or think you don't, come and see it. Come and see it. It's for the stage. You don't get it just by reading it. And I think there's been a mistake in the English curriculum, school curriculum, where they're made to study it as English literature,
Hmm.
not drama. Because Shakespeare would get a real kick knowing that people were reading it, and he'd be like, "Huh, that's really funny. Why are they reading it? They should be performing it." And
It's
and
it's kind of it's kind of like sorry to interrupt, but it's kind of like if to use a modern reference, it's kind of like how John Lennon felt when he found out that academics were trying to take apart Beatles lyrics, and then he wrote "I Am the
oh
Walrus"
yeah,
as a response to that. Because at the
that
end of the day,
yeah,
it's like, why are you putting too much thought into this? It's not
exactly.
meant to
I
be
mean,
this.
Paul McCartney was on recently, exactly the same. And the first line of the big first Beatles song I saw her standing there was "She was just 17, you know what I mean." And the
Hmm.
amount of essays and interviews and people going to goes, I think it's coming from this kind of this Brechtian kind of thinking of, but and he's like, no, no, mean rhymes with 17. That's it. And and yes, that you can get intellectual into Shakespeare, and you should, because sometimes there is more to it. I mean, if you look at some of the great big soliloquies from Hamlet, the musings of the to be or not to be, you know, there must have been a way that Shakespeare wrote it that he had in mind, with the stress and intonation that he thought, you know what, this is how I envisage Hamlet being in this scene. He's got all this stuff going on, and this is what I want him to do. And he wrote it. He wrote down to be or not to be. That is the question, whether it is nobody in the mind. He wrote it all down with a
Right.
certain delivery in his mind. Didn't record it. There's no stage directions. There's no. The only clues we get are from the rest of the text before and the rest of the text after. And yet, if you look at all the ways that that has been performed, and each way that an actor performs it makes sense.
So I want to ask you this because this is something that I've been thinking about ever since September with the last interview. Now Colin asserts that that when we read a text like the to be or not to be, it sounds like it seems like we would put the stress on that is the question, as if it's a moral question of whether one should live or die, right? The
Mm,
question of suicide. But he asserts that you know that Shakespeare's intent was to be or not to be. That is the question.
mm,
It becomes a bit more reflective, like you know you know you know what is the true quandary of the play. It's not
mm,
or not the play, but the moral dilemma. It's not whether or not he ought to commit suicide, but whether or not he should go through with the act of killing Claudius.
mm. Oh,
So yeah,
it's
yeah,
fascinating, isn't it?
and it's such a and yeah, exactly, and it actually changes it because if you actually say it out loud, like to be or not to be, that is the question. Like all of a sudden, it changes the trajectory of where you think is the play is going to go, as opposed to saying to be or not to be. That is the question. You know.
Yeah, and if you perform it with no stresses, again, it works even better. To be or not to be, that is the question. And
I mean,
that also at to be or not to be.
yeah,
That
exactly.
statement again. And again, I've seen versions of it. I've seen versions where the stress is on a different word. I've seen so many, and every single one makes sense. But again, you have to look at then the context of the wider play. What has happened before? How have the director and the actors set up the relationship between Claudius, Gertrude, and Hamlet, and Horatio and Hamlet, and all these amazing things that happen afterwards?
Right.
And
Because people
that,
because you do lose sight of of that because there's so many things happening, but but a lot of people will forget that the overall you know issue that Hamlet has to deal with is avenging his father, which means killing
mm,
Claudius. But
yes,
but I mean but I mean to your point, I mean people get so mired in in these soliloquies
yes.
that they kind of forget that they kind of think, oh, it's these are worlds within within themselves, but they kind of forget. No, Hamlet is speaking not not to an internalized feeling, but or should I say to his own little microcosm, but he is addressing an issue in the wider world, which is
Yes.
I was presented with this issue by this ghost who may or may not be my dead father, and who has
Mm,
told me I was murdered by your uncle who is now married to your mother. You've got to avenge me, right? So,
yeah.
because originally when I read it, I kind of lost sight of what was going on. So then, by the time you get to the end of the play, you're like, wait, like that's what he's doing now. Like, what the hell happened here? And
Yeah,
you're like,
I know. And then you're missing the other one as well. There's a subplot within the subplot within the subplot, and
right,
that's the plot of Fortinbras. Now, Fortinbras comes in as a kind of seems a minor character, but Fortinbras and Hamlet are kind of mirrors because they both lost their fathers at the same time, and they're both seeking vengeance, but Hamlet is seeking vengeance on on his father's killer, that fratricide, and
right,
Fortinbras is seeking vengeance because his dad was killed by Hamlet Senior.
right.
So they're
Well,
kind of the same age. They're on the same kind of path of vengeance, but one succeeds and one doesn't.
right, and that's and well, I guess to complicate matters, you've also got the issue with Laertes, who is
Yep.
who's also on his own vendetta mission because he believes
Yes.
that that Hamlet's responsible for killing Ophelia, who
And his dad.
well, I mean, to be fair, Polonius did have it coming. I mean, I
To be
didn't see
honest,
anything
yeah.
wrong with that.
If you're going to stand behind an arras and earwig, you're going to you're asking for trouble, really.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to there's a funny scene from from The Simpsons where they were doing their own version of it, and
Yes.
Bart he's playing Hamlet. He stabs, he stabs Polonius, and he's like, Polonius, what are you doing there? He's like, I hide behind curtains because I'm scared of getting stabbed. And I'm like,
That's
and I'm
brilliant.
like, and I'm like, that is the best way to sum up Polonius right there.
I mean, and that this you kind of say, oh, Hamlet's a tragedy, and I I sometimes think that the characters don't know they're in a tragedy, and so when Horatio and Marcellus are on the tower at the beginning, they
Yeah.
don't know it's a tragedy. To them, it's another day. At the end, they do it's a tragedy, and I think a lot of productions I've seen which start in a tragedy mindset, it's very hard to watch. The first line, "Who's there?" in a very tragic way. It's like, oh dear, we're in for 4 hours of really intense tragedy. And I do sometimes think that people forget it's entertainment. There are very funny lines in Hamlet. There are some very funny bits in it. And it's not all tragedy. It is a tragedy. It's the tragedy of Hamlet.
Hmm.
But there are really funny bits in there. And not just the comic interludes. It's very funny. But there is that tragedy into it. And I think if you approach it as a tragedy, all a tragedy, then it kind of comes away from what I think Shakespeare was trying to do. If you think about, and it comes back to the point that I was saying about Shakespeare being for the everyman.
Hmm.
A lot of the time, the Shakespeare's Globe was for the and all theatre at that time. It was the mass media. You didn't have radio. The illiteracy rate was very high, and theatre was cheap and common. You'd go to the cinema, sorry, the theatre just as much as you would flick on TikTok or go turn on the TV. You'd go, oh, what am I going to do now? I'll go to the theatre, and you'd get 6,000 braying groundlings. They're ill-educated, they're smelly, they're probably drunk, they're baying for blood. They're not going to stand around for a tight 4.5 hours of tragedy. They want to be entertained. They want a little bit of love, a bit of cheeky satire. They want a rude word or two. They want a plot. They want a sword fight. They want everything. And that's what I think the plays are all about. They're all about entertainment. And this comes back to the theme that you've asked me to kind of to cover, and that's the theme of politics. And
Yeah.
what I think the plays were, they were a really good early example of mass media, because you had 6,000 people regularly, 2 or 3 plays a day, 6 days a week, all the way through the year. You can get political opinion through there. You can get kind of satire in there. And there are examples, surviving examples of satire in the plays. And often it gets overlooked, and people try and explain it. And the best example I can think of is in the play Much Ado About Nothing, when
Hmm.
Beatrice is talking about the bear ward. I'd take sixpence for the bear ward, and it doesn't kind of make sense if you read it with modern eyes. And I often talk about if you watch current affairs programs now, or we've got a program called Have I Got News for You, and Mock the
I
Week.
watched that. Yes,
Yeah,
Ian Hislop and Paul Merton. Yep.
that's it. So it's like when you watch a rerun of those programs 6 months down the line, and you go, "I'm sorry, what on earth are you talking about?" It makes no sense later on. And when Beatrice is talking about the Bear Ward, what Shakespeare was doing at the time, they were having an argument with their neighbours at the Globe, which was the Bear Pit, and the guy who owned the Bear Pit was giving them grief and hassle. So he wrote it into the play, basically
It's
having a
like a
go,
dig. Yeah.
a dig. And of
Yeah.
course, if you're there at the time, and someone goes, "Hey up, that bear ward," everyone's going to roll about laughing, going, "That is the greatest bit of satire I've ever heard. That's wonderful," and it stays. And now, what, 400, 500 years, people have been going, "Oh yes, the bear ward." And yes, well, Shakespeare's obviously making a comment about the bear. Could the bear be the Russian bear? Could it be this bear? No, it was the annoying neighbour next door. And sometimes those satire get in there. And I think um, the politics at the time were well, I was going to say they're different, but they're kind of not. You can see similarities and differences between modern politics and modern goings on. Um,
Hmm.
but I think it's contextual, and I think people, when looking at Shakespeare, need to remember the context, both historical, political, to kind of understand Shakespeare better. To go back to Much Ado About Nothing, you start, you don't get any background, you just get Dom Pedro and his merry men turning up after a war. And then all the fun and games proceed from there. There's no explanation as to what the war was, why they were in, Padua, why they're in Italy, if they're Spanish. Um, and then you got to think, well, hang on, these people who are clowns essentially in this play, people like Benedict, who is a proper clownish figure, he's not a clown, he's a fighter, he's a soldier. And if you think about 15th century, 16th century warfare, it was brutal. It was man to man, eye to eye. If you didn't kill the person in front of you, they would kill you. And if you didn't trust the man on your right, you would be dead. And these people, they are killers, they're hardened men. They're kind of almost psychopathic in a way that they're kind of they kill.
It's
And
kind of like
yet,
how we make fun of the Vietnam War vets because of the
yes,
things that they've seen and done, and I mean, every movie, every show that you see, you have that one-legged Vietnam vet. He's like, "I've seen things, man. I've seen
yes,
things."
that's it. Even over in England, you get the kind of phrase, "You don't know, man. You weren't there."
Yeah,
And
exactly,
and
exactly.
yet people go, oh yes, Benedict, what a lovable character, and you go, well, he's quite clearly not.
But they're missing the point because
Yes.
and I can speak from experience because my because my parents, they came from Southeast Asia in the
Mm,
70s, and if you're familiar with what happened over there, it was a huge shit show for the next
mm,
20 years. And my dad
absolutely.
and my dad was a soldier, and my mother, she lived through the killing fields in Cambodia. And what struck me was the fact that everybody had a black sense of humor. And
Yes.
I remember my mother telling me, she told me how one day in the camps, because how my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, by the way, they they had to deal with the camp commandant, and he was this young lad, probably like late mid to late 20s, and when you're that young and you've been invested with all that power, you kind of feel like you're on top of the world. And and surprisingly, he was acting very courteous towards them because because when you're part of that regime, there's only one thing that you do, and you basically just torture and kill people. But
Mm.
he was behaving very reasonably well. And and my mother was like, my grandmother turned to my grandfather and said, that commandant is such a nice boy. It's such a shame he kills people, though. And I'm like and I'm like that
Whoa.
and I'm like, that is, I mean, that is just the beans. That is how you survive trauma, is to have that
Yes.
kind of sense of humor. So so I do want to I do want to go back a little bit, because
Yeah.
this is my wheelhouse here. Renaissance to early modern warfare. I read the stuff, and I've even bought the costume. So every November when I go to a Renaissance festival, I dress like a 17th century pikeman. I mean, you
Oh,
want to keep
nice. What faction are you? A Roundhead or a Cavalier? New Middle
um
Army?
think more of Holy Roman Empire. So
Oh,
so I've got the Morian helmet with the red feathers, and I've got the breastplate, and the back plate, and then I've got the what do you call it? It's like the buff coat, and then
oh
the boots and
yes,
everything.
nice.
I don't have a pike though, but I have a spear. Um, but that's a topic for a different time. But but going back to your point about Benedict being a soldier, I mean, you have to keep in mind that for England, they've been at war since 1337 up until 1453 in the Hundred Years'
Yes,
War, right?
yes,
And then we have that brief interlude, and then 20 years after that, we've got the Wars of the Roses
yeah,
that basically tears apart England. But on the
yeah,
continent itself, France, has just recovered from the Hundred Years' War, but then they decide to go on a military adventure in Italy, where for the next 20 to
yes.
30 years they're fighting the Spanish and the Habsburgs for influence in the Italian peninsula. And
Mm,
as you've referred, this was brutal fighting. We're
yes.
talking about warfare that hasn't been seen on unprecedented level. And I recall a scene from the Borgias. You remember that Showtime series, the Borgias, with Jeremy
I'm
Irons?
aware of the of Borgias. I know
Okay, so
I know the story of the family. Yes.
so there's a scene in the Borgias where the French are marching into on Lucca, the city of Lucca, and the messenger rides up and tells King Charles, my liege, they're willing to surrender, but they need to discuss terms. And the king says, "Oh well, we'll show them terms." And he produces these cannons, and they're firing like these huge these huge rounds into the city walls. And and in that brief scene, there's like this terror because the Italians have never seen cannon fire before.
Mm,
They're not used to the fighting that the French have been used to for those past hundreds of years. So and there's another scene too, where the army of the Papal States marches outside of Rome to try to block Charles from ransacking Rome. And you have all these Italian troops kind of massed out on the plain, right? And they're thinking, oh, they're just going to charge. It's kind of like with Braveheart, with both armies charge the field and attack. No, the French are standing there, and they do what they did at Lucca. They pull out the cannons and they fire, and it's just they fire just a few shots, but the entire army is decimated. Like,
yeah.
everybody gets mowed down. So So imagine being being among those ranks, having to see this new kind of warfare. It's the equivalent of,
Yes.
of, of what happened in World War I, where people thought they were fighting a conventional war.
And became
Line
that war of
form.
attrition. Yeah.
Yeah, traditional line formations, cavalry, and everything. By the time you get to 1917, it's a completely different world.
And you see
Um,
tanks rolling across no man's land. Yeah.
exactly. So to go
Yeah.
back to your point about Benedict, I mean, Benedict being the character that he is, I
Mm.
mean, you're talking, at the surface level, you're saying to yourself, oh, this is just a guy that likes to clown around. But when you understand the context and you kind of put
Yeah.
yourself in that mentality, it's like this is a guy who's processing a lot of trauma, right? This is a
Yes.
man
He's
who's got
yes.
who has to find some way to retain his sanity, because because especially if he's been fighting in Italy, he's probably had to deal with charging into pike formations. He's probably had to deal with arquebus fire. He's probably had to see his mates getting mowed down
Yes.
by all this new technology. I mean, I mean, if he, if he doesn't do something, he's probably going to lock himself in a room and off himself, right?
Exactly. I mean, or he could have been fighting in the Spanish Peninsula against the Moors, which again was happening at the same time. Again, a completely different style of fighting again.
Right,
And
right.
you are absolutely right. And then, so you get Pedro, who treats everything like a military campaign, which kind of makes sense because he's used to it. Right, that there, that there. He's playing a game of chess all the time. He's 3 moves ahead, and he treats it like that. And you got Claudio, who's come
Yeah.
through this fighting and survived. And no wonder he doesn't know how to deal with women. He's been spending his life trying to survive in these battles.
It's a
So it
universal
adds a different layer.
lesson. Yeah, it's a
Mm.
universal thing that people still deal with. I mean, I've experienced it firsthand. I mean, when my father came to the U.S., and I came along, he pretty much he really didn't know how to raise kids. He knew how to guard prisoners, but he didn't know how to raise kids. So he was like, well,
Is it the same thing?
yeah, well, he's misbehaving. I'll just pull out my belt and whip him a little bit, and then he'll shut
Oh
up. So,
gosh. Oh
so it's
dear.
that's a bleak picture into my childhood.
Just let
but,
them out.
but
Let them out for half an hour of exercise time.
exactly, but to go back to your point, I mean, those three are pretty much. I mean, if you think about it, they kind of represent like the three ways that people that former military people kind of process civilian life. One could
Mm.
either see life as a big joke, the other could permanently see themselves in the military and kind of like put themselves in discipline, and the other is just a wreck and just is like the only place I feel comfortable is when I'm on the battlefield with my boot on someone's neck, getting ready to plunge my spear into them.
I mean,
You know,
and then
I
if
mean
you
that's
then
tragic in itself.
no, it is. But then if you apply that context now, looking at the play, it really does change it. I mean, it's still hilariously funny, and some of the lines and the twists and tales are really funny. But if you add that layer of context to it, it suddenly becomes almost black humor, almost a dark comedy,
Exactly. Yeah.
instead of this kind of clownish buffoonery, which we all love. We all love Kenneth Branagh falling off the deck chair in his version. We
But it
all
kind of
love the
misses the
kind of
mark, though. That's the
it
thing.
does because they ride in, and when they ride, and there's this great scene at the beginning of Branagh's version where they ride over the hillset, and there's Keanu Reeves, and his locks are blowing in the air, and his shirt's just a little bit uncomfortably unbuttoned a bit too far. You know
Yeah,
that
like
kind of heroic.
Fabio.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you got even Baracchio's looking quite noble as they're kind of striding, and Don Pedro's it's Denzel. He's looking so amazing, and there's not a mark on him. They're all smiles and they're all very heroic. And you
Yeah,
go,
he's never
hang
been in a
on,
war.
I don't, yeah, and it just doesn't because he's played it as they're the noble victors who've arrived, and it almost as if he hasn't quite understand how I'm going to call it medieval for the want of a better word, how medieval or late medieval warfare works
Hmm.
or the effect it could have. I mean, there's a reason that the life expectancy. I read a paper recently where it was only like 1890 when people started dying of old age, because
Right.
up to then it was cholera, war, famine, pestilence,
Right.
everything else.
and they were all products of war too, because if you because I read Peter Wilson's book about the 30 Years War. I
Mm,
mean it's amazing to think that it was a third of of the population of the Holy Roman Empire died indirectly because of what happened, because because most of the deaths occur because of disease and starvation and famine,
yes.
caused by these armies that were marching through. And keep in mind too. I mean, no part of the Holy Roman Empire was untouched. I mean,
Mm,
if it wasn't the Swedes causing devastations, it was the French. As part of their policy to try to weaken the Habsburg Empire and effectively neuter the Holy Roman Empire.
mm.
Um,
I mean, even if you look at Henry V's march, the historical, how many of his troops died before he even got anywhere near Agincourt?
exactly.
And the historical records show that if he hadn't fought then and there at Agincourt, he wouldn't have survived. It was a kind of do or die moment. I mean, it's been dramatized, and we've got this lovely kind of this image of Henry V, the warrior king. But literally, it was his last chance. Otherwise, his army would have just either dysenteried away or run away. It was he was losing control, and it was that
Right.
amazing victory that just happened at the right time in the right place, and that changed everything. The march from to Agincourt was bleak, really bleak.
It's actually surprised that the English won at all, considering the fact that they were dwindling in numbers, whereas the French pretty much had the advantage. I mean, it all just came down
Mm,
to a muddy field at the end. You know.
mm. I mean, I've had the privilege of visiting the site, and it's a French-run museum, and it's very bizarre because when you go there, it has the obligatory kind of English commentary, and
Hmm.
we went there, and we watched this video about the background to Agincourt, and it was like 1415 Agincourt, and then it was a picture of Churchill, and then Margaret Thatcher, and I'm like, hang on, what is this? And it was talking about British imperialism,
It's an
and
ad for the Tories, so.
and I was like, what is going on? And then it was basically, if you read the between the lines, it was like, oh, the English cheated. And I was like, hang on. And there's a monument. Just there's lots of monuments around it. There was a tragic battle. It was a really on both sides. It was an awful battle. But there's
Right.
a statue, and it's dedicated, and it was purchased. I need to make sure I might be wrong, but this is how I remember it. It's purchased or paid for by the French police force, and it's a statue of this chap who was a provost officer in the
Hmm.
army, who officially, the first policeman, brutally slain in his prime by the wicked, cheating English. And there's this statue of this random provost officer. I'm like, this is very strange. And it comes down to, I've seen there's lots of great you mentioned David Starkey in your early kind of our
Yeah.
chat beforehand. There's this lovely documentary, and it does come down to the fact that the tactics on the day, literally Henry was looking at his troops going, ah, what do I do? I literally can't do anything. I this is what I'm going to do. I'll do what I've got, and I'll see how that works. And it worked. He lost. He didn't have many mounted knights. He saw that there were 10,000 French mounted knights. There's no way you're going to go into battle against them, as as typical medieval warfare would be. You can't do that.
Right.
So he had to go with what you've got. I've got so many archers. Well, I've got them. I might as well use them. Right. Okay. Let's use the archers and see what happens. We've got this nice bit of narrow ground. Let's use that. And it turns out it was the perfect combination. I mean, they would call it the perfect storm of tactics. And it just worked. And because it was, in the French words, anti chivalry, it was anti the tactics of the day. It was anti what was expected of a king. A king should be noble and lead his men into battle, not hide behind the row of stakes and let the archers do the work. And again, it came down to class as well, because the bowmen were more likely to be working class peasants. And here these working class peasants managed to decimate the French nobility. And that kind of class war was not taken very well. And I think you can call Henry a military genius, and there is an argument for that as well, because he's inspired, he picked the right tactics. But I think, I mean, I'm a big soccer fan.
No, you can say
And
football. I know what you mean.
and you get the tactics. You go, well, I haven't got all of that, so I'll do this. I'll do this formation. I'll try this play, and you just work with what you've got. And I think that's what happened. And if that's genius, then you can call it genius, and if it's just desperation, you can call it that as well. But it turned out to be a kind of moot point in the end, because he died before the French king, so it was never kind of it never
Realized.
came to pass. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what's ironic is that 40 years later, the English will cry foul because Jean Bureau, the slowly guy was elevated by Charles VII to become his master of artillery, and it would be the artillery that would end up decimating the English knights. I think it was at either Formigny or Castillon. I can't remember.
I can't remember off the top of my head now.
But but you could sort of see the reversal and an irony, because whereas in 1415 the French were crying foul over the English longbowmen, now the English knights are crying foul over the French using field artillery to kind of win these battles. So,
I mean, it would be replayed again in 1815 in the Battle of Waterloo.
That's true.
I mean,
yes.
Wellington famously described his own infantrymen as scum. He didn't trust them, and he gave them the most simple instructions because he thought that they were too stupid to follow complicated ones. And you got these French cavalrymen, and throughout history, the horse has been kind of interlinked with the higher classes, if that makes sense. Because if you have a horse, you're of a higher, quote unquote, higher class. And here you've got these squares of scum, to use the phrase, absolutely destroying the French cavalry. And yes, it was a tactical blunder on the fault of Napoleon's marshals, but that's not the point. It was the fact that the common man had beaten the better, if that makes sense. The scumbag has beaten the ruler, and I think throughout history we see these things. We have the peasants' revolt. We have the Agincourt. We have Waterloo. We have the Peterloo massacre, which flips the other way, where the army destroyed the everyman, and we do see this class war, and that kind of comes into the Tudor politics, because at the time you've still got people who in Elizabethan England who still remember what it was like before, and I think Tudor politics can be split into two distinct phases. Pre-Elizabethan and then kind of Elizabethan. You've got the whole, I mean, you can't go into it now because literally it's a can open worms everywhere if you talk about Henry VIII, because it was his his belief in the divine right of kings, and that led to the kind of dissolution of the monasteries and the break from Rome, and then his son being so passionately hooked into that way of thinking too, and there are people who talk about Bloody Mary, his sister, being the real bloodthirsty queen, and yet if you look at the historical records, Edward VI was worse. The way he put down revolts, there was one in Norfolk where he decimated. He was really ruthless, brutal, and yet the
But it pales in comparison
got
to the
put
way
into
that
hers.
But I was going to say, but it pales in comparison to the way that Henry VIII, especially in his later years, kind of put down put down these
absolutely.
rebellions. Actually, I actually do want to talk a little bit about pre-Elizabethan Tudor politics, because
Yes.
because we didn't mention the Wars of the Roses earlier, right?
Yes.
And obviously we get Henry VII, who unites both the houses of York and Lancaster to create the Tudor dynasty, and then we get and then things go well for a little while. He dies. He's the miser king, and everybody is happy that Henry VIII. Although, to be fair, Henry was never meant to be king. It was supposed to be his brother
No.
Arthur. Um,
Yes.
but you mentioned this a minute ago, um but the whole break with with Rome, as convention tells us, is because
Mm.
Henry was very desperate to have a son, because he'd been married to Catherine of Aragon for, I think, what, 30 years ish, give or take.
Yeah, he's been a long time.
And they only had one child, who would end up becoming Mary, or Bloody
Mm.
Mary. And
Mm.
in modern sensibilities, you would think, well, I mean, it's a no-brainer. Mary would be queen, right? But keep in mind, I mean, we're talking about a period that's not too divorced from the Wars of the Roses, and because Henry is very much aware of just how tenuous his family's hold on power is.
Yes.
So, and especially in the North, I mean, you have people who are kind of saber rattling, or just looking for any excuse to kind of throw off the yoke and kind of go back to the way
Yes.
that things were. I mean,
Yes.
and we can look back to the Perkin Warbeck incident, where Henry VII, violently, made quite sure that everybody knew, yes, there is a king of England, and it's me. It's not this imposter here, who claims to
No, I
be
mean,
Richard.
we had Lambert Simnel as well. I mean, he just got let off by being put in the kitchens to work. But
That's right. That's right.
Perkin Warbeck was really kind of, yes, a bit of a show of power. Who's king? I'm king. And
Right.
it was really kind of a show of strength. I mean, if you think about Henry VII, I think there was uh, he had a very interesting life. He spent most of it in France,
Yeah,
just
he was in exile. Yeah, yeah.
out of the way. And his, I think his grandfather married Henry V's widow, Queen Catherine.
Yeah, Owen Tudor, wasn't it?
Yes, that was Queen Catherine, the one from Henry V.
Yeah,
He
exactly. Yeah.
married, and then so that was the kind of the dynastic link then.
And
But
wasn't
Henry
wasn't
the
his mother wasn't his mother Margaret Beaufort? Wasn't she a
Margaret
descendant of
Beaufort,
John of?
yes.
Wasn't she distantly related to John of Gaunt?
John of Gaunt, yes.
Okay.
It's very interlinked. A lot of these kind of royal families,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
gene pool is more of a puddle, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's very close.
Not Habsburg,
Not
muddied,
certainly
but
not. You haven't got the Habsburg chin going on, but you've got a lot of very close connections, and you do see it when you look at the names of the families coming up. You seem to get the same ones: Devereux, Seymour, Boleyn, Carey, Beaufort. You get the same names coming through, and
and the
that's
Howard
because
clan too. So
the Howard clan, yeah, absolutely. The Dudleys, all these people, all these families that have that influence over him. And, Henry had a really interesting life. And he was, again, not raised thinking he was going to be king. There was no expectations on him going to be. But as kind of a Lancastrian, he would have seen from afar what had been happening. Being in the French court, or being around the French court, he would have heard the stories of what was been happening, heard about the Henry VI, and heard about how Edward IV was that kind of battle. And then, of course, Edward IV was exiled to France as well. They fled after Henry VI was reinstated. So it was a back and forth all the time. So I can see that Henry would have grown up thinking, actually, we need stability here. We need kind of, we can't have this back and forth all the time. We need that kind of that one stability, and going through fighting Richard III. And there was a big kind of hoo-ha in this country a while ago. You probably read about you seem to be very medievalist kind of expertise when they found Richard III and in a car park, and
I remember. Yes, I remember reading about that. Yeah,
it
yeah.
was amazing. And just there was
Where
there
was
was
it?
the
Was
hit.
it Leicester?
It was
Where they found
Leicester,
it?
yeah. They
Okay.
found it, and there's the historian angle, and then there's kind of the romantic ideal. and there's the Richard of York society, and I'm a proud Yorkist girl. I come from that area. I wear my white rose with pride, and I don't care who knows it. But
Just
at
don't
the
go to
time,
Lancaster. That's all.
well, yeah, not too loud. Keep it quiet. But there was the Richard of York Society have always protested that he's been vilified, and again, it comes down to Tudor politics because when Henry V, a lot of the information that we know about Richard III comes from Shakespeare's play, and he was writing for at the time he was writing for the Lord Chamberlain. Lord Chamberlain George Carey, Henry Carey. I can't remember which one's which. I think it's definitely a Carey, Lord Chamberlain,
Okay.
who's the son of Mary Boleyn, who was the sister of Anne Boleyn, who was the mother of Elizabeth I.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're thinking, right, I'd like you to write a play, please, William. Excellent. I'm going to write a play about Richard III. What, you mean the guy that almost killed the Queen's grandfather? Yes, and I'm going to make him a proper villain. Oh, and is the Queen's grandfather going to make an appearance in the play? Yes, and he's going to be great.
Yeah. He's just gonna make him a complete twat, because
Yeah,
why not?
why? And a lot of our kind of it's that Mandela effect, isn't it? A lot of that kind of our visions of Richard III come from that Shakespearean thing, this crooked back. You got Anthony Shear on crutches playing this kind of almost tarantula-like figure of Richard III.
Or
I'm a
Benedict
villain.
Cumberbatch too.
It's haunting versions. And so there was this massive kind of media storm about the finding of Richard III. And this woman, I mean, personally, I don't particularly like her. I'm sure she's a lovely person, but the way she came across, I didn't like her. She found it and then she said, "Oh, well, I found it because the grave spoke to me." I said, "Oh, please." And
Okay.
There was an R on the tarmac, and I just knew that's where he was. Like, oh my gosh, no, okay, fine,
She
right,
sounds like a
okay.
psychic.
Well, psychic is a close word, but so when they uncovered this person, they dug it up and they went, "Oh, we found this grave. Oh, brilliant! It looks like he's been in a battle. Oh, fantastic! Oh, he's got a crooked spine. What?" So for years they've been saying, "Oh no, it was just a Shakespearean kind of twist. He's put this crook back because the Victorians' view, if you had a crooked back, you were kind of crooked yourself. Oh, he's got a crooked spine. You're joking." And the face of this woman dropped because for years they'd be saying, "No, he didn't have a hunchback. He didn't have he was perfectly normal. It's just Shakespeare." And it turns out he did have a crooked spine. What? This is news. And they rebuilt his face. And there was this very toe curling scene. And if you can find it, I highly recommend you watch it. But it's one of those uncomfortable watches. Do you know when you're almost hiding behind a cushion going, "Oh no, I can't watch it." Where she comes face to face with the real face of Richard III. And she walks into the room and go, "Oh, he's beautiful. When I look into his eyes, I don't see the eyes of a killer." And I had to stop it then because I thought, hang on, no. You do not become a medieval monarch without having to kill some people. You do not survive so many battles because he was his brother's right-hand man for so many years. If you think the Battle of Barnet, Richard III led the successful right flank. All these battles that he was involved in, he wasn't a soft, stay-at-home guy. He was a fighter. He was a warrior.
Right. And what's even fascinating is the fact that this was the norm. I mean, really, Henry VI was, if anything, he was the abnormal
He
monarch.
was, because he wasn't that warrior.
Right.
He was more of the kind of the use your advisors, kind of you do the fighting, I'll do this.
Yeah, because he was raised by he was mainly raised by clerics, wasn't he?
Yes,
Or influenced by clerics, I should say.
Yes, that's it. And then You get Edward IV, who is a proper Yorkshire lad, proper hard, really into fighting, and he was a very big warrior. And the whole York family, Edward, Richard, and even to a lesser extent George, they were fighters. They were raised to be fighters. And there's historical documents that kind of people have studied, and they kind of hypothesize that if Richard had met Henry 1-to-1, there would have been only one outcome, and that was a Yorkist victory. There's no way that Henry Tudor, with his lack of battle experience, could have beat Richard III in combat.
Yeah, which makes Bosworth Field all the more astonishing, given the fact
Yes.
that Richard did have the advantage in terms of experience, and most of his troops were battle hardened veterans, whereas Henry for the most part most of his troops were mercenaries, weren't they?
Yes, yeah, French mercenaries. He had some Welsh bowmen there. Richard had the cannons, and if you're a kind of poor mercenary, or just come, or you're a local farmhand who've got a bill hook and you'd come along for the ride, if you've never seen a cannon before, and here's the king. The king at the time was this mythical presence. If you're a poor farmhand who's going to go, yeah, I believe in Henry Tudor's cause, I'm going to go and fight, and you see the King of England at the time, that divine right of kings. So essentially, for the everyman, the king was God's presence on earth, and he would have been in his fine armor, and he would have had a crown on his helmet, and all these cannons. It would have been literally awesome. Not the word that we use now, oh, that's awesome, but awesome sight.
Right.
Oh my God, that is literally God on earth. This is the King of England. And so that presence would have kind of really offset a lot of Henry's confidence, I think. There was a story about the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, one of the early Yorkist Lancastrian scuffles. And at the time, there was a phenomenon where there was ice crystals in the air, and it caused a solar flare, which looked like a crucifix, like a double crucifix. And I think it was Edward of York's father, Richard of York, who used it to his advantage and said, "Oh, this is God obviously blessing us on the battlefield." So that religion was really a kind of very important thing. And again, it comes back to the kind of what was inspiring Shakespeare to write his plays. There was still a lot of religious elements in there, because in Richard III, you've got this king. Yes, he's portrayed as being this villainous kind of spidery character who puts his brother into a vat of wine, and who kind of tricks his way. And I'm not going to go into it, but I'll just mention it. The Prince is in the Tower. There's a whole big debate about that to be explored at another time.
But Richard III is basically the Renaissance version of House of Cards, if you think about it.
Yes, he is. He's that kind of one who plays it all, doesn't he?
Yeah, it's Frank Urquhart with the crown, essentially.
Yeah, because as soon as his brother dies, he's there. He puts the sons into the Tower of London for their own protection. He seizes that. He finds that his brother had declared him on his deathbed that no one else was around, that he would be Lord Protector, and you can't do that on a whim. You can't. He's got to have been thinking about it, and he suddenly takes that power. He suddenly takes that throne. So in Shakespeare's world, the everyman that would have went to see his play would have went, that's awful grammar, who would have gone to see his plays would have been aware of the divine right of kings. So Shakespeare dares to show a king of England, the anointed one, being taken over by this Lancastrian usurper.
Well, what's fascinating too is the fact that Shakespeare doesn't pull any punches. He shows the political maneuvering, and
yes.
And I was watching Ken Burns' documentary on the Vietnam War. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a very good watch. And there was this one episode where they were talking about the campaign of '68, where the Democratic Party was in disarray, right? And then and then you had Nixon on the other side, and and as you're watching, the episode, you learned that Nixon had to do a lot of underhanded backroom deals because the North Vietnamese were very, very close to signing, making peace with South Vietnam, right?
Yeah.
And Johnson had everything, aligned and ready to go. Nixon goes in, does a little backdoor deal, and torpedoes the whole peace process because he basically convinces President Two of South Vietnam to back out of the peace, the peace deal, because he assures him that he's going to be able to get him um, a much better settlement when he's president. Um,
Mm.
and what's even more fascinating is that Johnson was very much aware of what happened because they tapped the South Vietnamese embassy, so they were in on they knew exactly what happened, but Johnson couldn't say anything. So
Mm.
Nixon got into the White House because Johnson had to keep his mouth shut because if he exposed Nixon, he would have to expose the fact that the CIA bugged the South Vietnamese, and that would lead to even
Yeah.
more
Revealing your hand too early.
exactly. So we see this power play, happening even in modern politics, because
Mm.
and coincidentally enough, it was Richard who did all of this. Um,
Yes. I mean, if you looked back and if it was a plot, if it was like a John le Carré novel, you go, oh, brilliant, well done.
that could never happen
That
in real life, but then
that couldn't happen really, but well done, and
right,
it
but
did.
then you see something, but then you see what Richard Nixon did, and you're like, I don't know if I should be mad at this guy or like applaud him because he got what he wanted, but
Yes,
but in the process he extended the Vietnam War for another 5 years,
for his
costing
own
many more
political
lives.
gain. Yeah.
Exactly, and and you could even say Richard Nixon is like a modern version of Richard III because because this is a man who he cheats and lies and steals his way to the top, and he uses terror tactics, kind of like what Richard III did
And
in the
also
plays.
started as vice president. The right hand man.
Exactly, and let's also keep in mind because and correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't Richard III have like a cadre of men he sort of like leaned on to do his dirty work for him?
He was always seemed to have his hands clean.
Right, right. Whereas
You know,
Nixon he had the plumbers to do the things for him, while he could sit
yes.
back and say I'm as clean as a whistle.
That's why just there's this historical evidence that says that Richard of York was, oh sorry, Richard III, as he was then, was nowhere near the Tower of London when the princes were said to have been killed.
I'm not a crook. That's what he would have
I,
said.
or I'm not a crookbat.
I,
Even better.
I mean, the
Uh,
parallels are just
you
remarkable
know,
because one is metaphorically crooked and the other one was literally crooked.
exactly. And just you can see it all the time through Shakespeare. And I don't think Shakespeare was being, you know, uh, deliberately, intelligently political. I think he was at the big at the base of what Shakespeare was doing was he was an entertainer. He wrote to entertain, and politics makes good stories.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I mean, if you look at some of the tragedies of Shakespeare's, out of 10, 40% of them are set in Rome. And so that is really interesting because if you think about the history of Rome, it went from kings to the Republic to the Empire.
But even then,
And
the Republic was like rife with with a lot of corruption
oh,
because
loads, so much corruption. And even then, the Empire was as well. I mean, it's only,
right. I
if
mean,
you
the
look at
Empire is a different animal altogether, though. I mean,
exactly, if you look at the history of the Empire, there's only one or two who die of natural causes. If you look at cause of death, son, wife, Praetorian Guard, murder, assassinated, it's a very dangerous career. But if you think about the point of Shakespeare's Roman tragedies, it could be talking about the republic versus monarchy, republic versus empire. And at the time, if you think about the expansion of the Elizabethan uh, uh, Britain at the time, it was expanding over the world. You had Virginia being
mhm.
coming into existence. You have the expansion of what would later become the British Empire. This is the start of it. There's a lot that happens in between, but you have this kind of taking over of the world as they saw it then.
Yeah.
So you have this making the commentary of Roman, you know, what's the difference between a republic and a monarchy? What's the pros and cons? So if you're doing that in a play, which I've said before is the mass media, it's the TikTok of its day. What should we do? Let's go and watch a play. Oh, what are we seeing? Julius Caesar, fantastic. Oh, look, a tyrant. Oh, that makes me think. Is our current ruler a tyrant? Oh, probably.
Shakespeare was 100 years early on the scene. I mean, it
Mm.
would take Cromwell to kind of realize that. I mean, can we call it a Shakespearean dream of republicanism? I mean,
To be honest, I like to think that Shakespeare was, um, not not that subtle. I like to think that Shakespeare went, oh, do you know what? It's a good play. Uh, yeah, it sounds like a good plot. I'll do that. At the end of the day, he died as a gentleman. It's on his gravestone as a gentleman. It's not a playwright. It's not a poet. On his gravestone is "Here lies William Shakespeare, a gentleman." And he's seen his father go through financial ruin and scandal and hardships. At the end of the day, he was a businessman. Shakespeare. He wanted money. It doesn't take him very long into his playwriting career before he buys the new place in Stratford, and therefore gives his family security.
yeah,
He
doesn't he
has money.
doesn't he purchase a coat of arms for his father?
Yeah, his father gets the coat of arms. I'm just going to double check the date because I can't remember off the top of my hand. But John Shakespeare, the glove maker, served
Yeah.
time on Stratford City Council. He unfortunately went into some corrupt scandals, but eventually the coat of arms. What was it? Shakespeare coat of arms. He was declared a gentleman, had the right to a coat of arms, and now he has money, he has income, and he's thinking, do you know what? That's really good. I like this. What plays do people want to see? The first play he wrote was one of the Henrys, and Henry the Sixth Part Two, and people loved it. So he wrote Part Three, and then people wanted to know what happened first, so he wrote Part One.
It's
He
like
wrote what
I
the
mean, this is the original like MCU before
yes, yeah,
before
no,
we got it. Yeah.
it's the origin story. He does, Henry the Sixth. This is the story. Right, we need a sequel. Brilliant. Right, we need to know the prequel, and he does it, and you can
Oh
see
yeah, so
well.
It's like Star Wars actually because you get
Yes,
the original trilogy first, and then 30 years late, and then I guess 20 years later you get the prequel with
yes,
with Anakin
but
Skywalker.
yeah, but I was going to say something, a comment about Jar Jar Binks being Falstaff, but I couldn't quite make it make it fit in my thing. So yeah, the coat of arms was gifted to John Shakespeare in 1596.
Okay, gotcha.
So Shakespeare was writing then. He was 1596. So by then he'd already written Midsummer Night's Dream, Taming of the Shrew, Titus, Richard III. So he was well on his way to becoming, a very well known. But also in London at the time, you had this amazing situation where you had four of the greatest playwrights that England has possibly ever seen at the time. So you had Shakespeare who was in London at the time, Kit Marlowe was in time, Ben Jonson and Robert Greene were all in London at the same time, writing plays, writing literature. And then you had this real quirk where they're all trying to outdo each other. And then one by one, all of them disappear. And this is not me saying Shakespeare did them all in. This is just that Robert Greene, he drank himself to death. You got Ben Jonson got into a brawl and was arrested and later died. Kit Marlowe and his bar brawl died. So you had suddenly all of Shakespeare's competitors were off the scene. So Shakespeare had spent this all time, and he didn't become successful by default. What he was doing, he was trying to outdo them all the time. They were all trying to outdo each other. Ben Jonson was trying to outdo Shakespeare, and Robert Greene was trying to outdo Kit Marlowe, and they were all trying to build themselves up. And then suddenly, three of them were gone.
It's
So
kind of like
Shakespeare,
London in the 60s when you had like the four major bands trying to outdo each other. If you think
yes,
about it.
absolutely. But then if you think then if there's all four bands are trying to outdo each other, and then three of them stop,
It's like who killed the Who? Oh,
who
well, I don't
killed the
know.
who?
What happened to the Stones? Oh, well,
Wow.
we don't know.
Yeah.
What about the Kinks? Oh,
Oh,
they got
no.
into a kinky situation. It's
But
just
then
the
you've got
Beatles
these
left.
yeah, these outlanders from Liverpool the upstart crows, if you will,
Exactly.
suddenly they've done it and they've worked hard. And it wasn't by default. He was a great writer, but it's just suddenly he had no competition.
Well, what's
And
also fascinating is the fact that I mean, out of all of them, Shakespeare, you would think he didn't have a chance because he didn't he didn't go to university.
no,
The most education he got was from the local grammar school,
yes.
right?
Yeah, he would have done. But the thing is, that was enough because, he had that basics of reading, the writing, the Latin, and that access to books. You see it all the time. The tale of Hamlet comes from an old Viking saga. The tale of Amleth where the uncle was avenged. You know,
Right, right.
the tales of Macbeth
Or
are in that.
Cymbeline too, because that was
Yes,
based on
all
a Celtic legend, wasn't it?
I can't. I don't know. I'm not too familiar with Cymbeline, but I know that
Okay.
Macbeth was a real person. Obviously, it's not the Macbeth that we see in the play, but the real Macbeth. I love this fact. Is actually mentioned in the Viking sagas because they were trying to invade the lands of Orkney, and they were kept getting trouble from the local king. And if you do the timelines, it's actually Macbeth. So the Vikings were coming over trying to take over these lands in Scotland, and Macbeth was fighting them back. I think that's wonderful. Just that even the Vikings didn't like Macbeth.
And that
Um,
that's I was gonna say at that time too. I mean, we're talking about when the printing press is like, it's becoming an institution. Like, I mean, now you're starting to get more. It's kind of like the birth of the internet. It's where information is
yes,
starting to become more freely available. So,
yes,
had he lived, in the 15th century, he probably wouldn't have
yes.
had as much access to information as he did, 100
Mm,
years later.
no, exactly. I mean, just the amount of information that he writes so much about Italy, Shakespeare. So why does he write about Italy? I mean, when you grow up and you study writing, the tutors will always tell you the same thing: write about what you know. So why does Shakespeare write about Italy so much? There's only
Yeah, there's
one
nothing
sol-
going on over there.
There's nothing going on over there, but yet he writes about it. Othello is set in over there. The Merchant of Venice, Gentleman of Verona, Taming of the Shrew is set in Padua and Verona. Romeo and Juliet is set in Italy. All these
Wasn't
things.
Twelfth Night set in Italy also?
Twelfth Night, I think it's Twelfth Night as well. It's set in Italy.
Okay.
The Tempest. It's not directly in Italy, but it's the Duke of Milan who's a main character. So all these things are Italian, and you have to go. Well, why are you there? So lots of scholars have gone. Well, that's because Shakespeare spent his lost years in Italy.
But there's no evidence for that though.
Exactly. It's hypothesis. It's the scholars. It's those lost years. I think my favourite one is that he was imprisoned for poaching. I like that one. I've just got this image of William Shakespeare carrying a boar out of a forest, and some guards coming up to him. Where did you get that boar? I found it. I just got this lovely kind of image of Shakespeare trying to kind of talk his way out of being arrested. But I mean, you are absolutely right, and that again is a really good point because Shakespeare was a nobody. That's why we don't know anything about him. He was a nobody. He was an oik from Stratford. He was an upstart crow, to quote Robert Greene. He came to London and nobody knew who he was. And that is very much the tale of history. History is written about the rich people, the kings, the queens, the lords, and you get the court records. If someone's done something wrong, but he doesn't appear in those. So he's obviously not been arrested. So he's bumbling around doing something. He's obviously doing enough to survive because he crops up later. His name's not on the death records. We've got him being married to Anne Hathaway. We've got him suddenly. Then we get him writing plays, and that's when his name starts becoming real, and that's when he gets more written about him. But because he was a nobody, we don't really know anything about him. So what he did in the lost years is a mystery. He knows lots about Italy. So was he in Italy? We don't know. He writes about wars. Was he a soldier? We don't know. He writes the way he writes about love is very interesting as well. Because if you look at some of his early plays, such as Taming of the Shrew, Love Labour's Lost, even A Midsummer Night's Dream, the way he writes about love is very different to how he writes about love later on. So it suggests that his view on love has changed. I mean, does that mean that he wasn't in love with his wife? Does that mean that he fell in love with someone else later on? Again, we just don't know. And that's the beauty of Shakespeare, is the ambiguity of everything we find.
Well, I'll go even further and say it's kind of irrelevant when you think about it, because it doesn't add or
No.
detract from the work that we have.
And that is absolutely brilliantly put. I'm reading Taming of the Shrew at the moment, and the prologue that this author has written. He says, if you read Taming of the Shrew, it's dreadful, it's awful, it's misogynistic, it's cheap laughs, it doesn't kind of make sense. And then you go and see it on stage, and it's funny. It's brilliant. It's the interplay between them, the farce that unfolds before your eyes is wonderful. And that's what it's for. Shakespeare on the stage being really kind of, oh, that's brilliant. And you're absolutely right. It doesn't detract from it. Whether he was in Italy, whether he fell in love, whether he was in love with the Earl of Southampton or the mysterious dark lady, who cares? He just wrote brilliant plays. And
Right.
that's why people kept going to see them. People in the Tudor times were very, very vocal. If they didn't like something, well, they would probably burn your place down or stone you or throw vegetables at you. They certainly wouldn't keep going back time and time and time again. And people would go back and they'd say, right, give us Henry VI Part 2. We want to see that one again. And some of these plays were being performed 2-3 times a day sometimes, and people would turn up. And that is the power of the politics which comes back into it. And Shakespeare was very much at the whim of his patron. So the Lord Chamberlain would say, right, I want you to make this play. Here's some money. Write me this play. It comes later on when he becomes a patronage of the king. So we've got 1603, James I, James VI coming over. And James VI, as he was, became a self-proclaimed expert of the witch. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to read his demonology book. It's interesting.
Yeah, wasn't it? I heard somewhere he'd been influenced by Malleus Maleficarum, because
Yes,
because I
there's
read
something.
because I read Roland Hutton's book The Witch, and he did touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, because basically James VI was born and instantly became king. He was crowned king at about a week old, and there's records that the earliest assassination attempts happened around about that time. So from his birth, he was the subject of assassination attempts. So he grew up so paranoid, it was unbelievable. Literally anything or anyone could be a target. Didn't trust anyone at all. And out of that fear, when we have the instance when he's sailing to England, and then there was storms, and
Right.
all it took was one person to say, "That's the local witch." That seed was planted in his mind,
I was
and
gonna
that was the
Yeah,
go on.
I was gonna say there's a documentary that Tony Robinson did.
Oh, Baldric.
Yeah, Baldric. He did a series called Gods and Monsters, and there's an episode about the witch that actually touches on the trial of the woman who was accused of summoning the storm to kill
Agnes Sampson.
James. Yes, Agnes Sampson. That's right. So I highly recommend everybody watch that, because it's such a good
Yes.
episode.
I mean, then you get the witch law in 1604, which is passed, which means that there's a instant hanging to anyone who's confirmed of being a witch, and then suddenly after that you get 1623. Is it the Salem witch trials?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Here, over in Massachusetts, and not and also too on the continent, because because you have the 30 Years War going on in Central Europe. That's when you start to see a higher proliferation of the witch trials.
Yeah.
And I remember watching a video that a Catholic priest was was saying that there would be instances where you would have dueling exorcisms, where a Catholic priest and a Protestant pastor would try to, they would come into town one week and try to drive out a demon and see, which one could do it better, and whoever won, that town would convert to the faith of whoever drove the demon out. So it's such a it's such a ridiculous
Yeah.
scenario, but I mean that was the period that they lived in, because religion and politics were
Yes.
very much
Yeah.
intertwined.
I mean, have you heard of the witch finder General Matthew Hopkins?
That he's more of like during the Civil War period, isn't he?
He was. I mean, I mention him just because I find his kind of the whole thing kind of very farcical.
Because he
Just
gave
that,
himself that power, he gave himself that authority,
yes,
didn't he? Like nobody,
and
like neither Parliament or the king were
oh,
like, they're like, we like, listen, we're busy fighting a war. You do whatever the hell you want to do.
whatever, and he would go and say, right, well, every witch I find, you pay me, and oh, he always found witches. It's just oh, just unbelievable. So
So
we've got James VI coming to
yeah,
the throne, and Shakespeare again, a canny businessman. He knows where his bread is buttered, and he's very smart in the way that he doesn't. I'm going to say the word piss off because I can't think of another phrase to say, but doesn't bite the hand that feeds. He knows. You got people before like Ben Jonson, who was always up for a bit of controversy. And then Shakespeare's like, no, no, I'm not playing with fire. I know I can write my plays and have a lovely, stable income. Thank you very much. So he writes this play, Macbeth, and it's a wonderful play. It is such a good play, and he introduces the Weird Sisters. He's writing it 1606, so it's fresh. 1604 was the witch law. He's writing this 1605, 1606. So we've had the gunpowder plot, and
mhm.
there's all the theories. Have you read Claire Asquith's book about the shadow play? You said you were a Catholic before, about all
Yeah,
the Catholic interplays, and I think one of the things that came into my mind was there's the scene where Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are talking, and he's got doubts, and she says, "I would rather have plucked the babe from my nipple and dashed its brains on the rock." And that dashing the brains of the rock is from Proverbs and from Psalms.
right.
So it's very biblical. So you can see these Shakespearean Catholic links coming through, and she puts forward a great argument that he was raised a Catholic,
Yeah,
but had to hide it.
because his mother Mary, because the Ardens, they were Catholics,
Yes,
weren't they?
they were. So
Whereas the Shakespeare's, they kind of they were kind of on the fence, but they sort of converted because it was just politically expedient.
yes, yeah, absolutely. And then don't forget, you got the Act of Uniformity in 1558,
That's right.
which
That's right.
which just said you had to go to Anglican Mass, or not Anglican Mass, but that you had to go to Mass once a week.
Hmm.
And what you did the rest of the time was absolutely open, which was kind of nice loophole for a lot of Catholics. So you've got this kind of Shakespeare's Catholic showing through a lot of his plays. So
Well,
you
to
have
go
the
back to
witches.
Well, I was gonna say,
Go on.
to go back even further to Hamlet. I mean, when Hamlet sees his father, he does mention he is in a purgative state, which would apply to the
Yes,
Catholic doctrine
purgatory.
of purgatory. Yeah,
Yes, you do. And then the praying scene where he talks about the mark of Cain. The very biblical kind of
yeah, because he
the,
killed Abel. Yeah,
yes, exactly, the murder of brothers, the original fratricide. So there's a lot of biblical references in Shakespeare's work. So you have Macbeth, the witches coming through, and it's clearly he's trying to suck up to his new patron. He talks about witches. It's set in Scotland. Scotland comes through as being brilliant. You've got that really, and it's really hard scene to watch between Malcolm and Macduff when they're talking about Scotland. Oh, Scotland, and oh, I just had to do the accent there, and that was really embarrassing. I shouldn't have done that, but never mind.
no,
You've got this
I
lovely.
mean, listen. I do accents all the time, so
Fine,
you are
it's
in good
fine.
company.
It's fine. So they have this big scene about Scotland and making sure Scotland's brilliant. And then the scene where he's talking about the descendant of kings, implying that James the First was the descendant of Banquo, the true kings of England. And you get this whole kind of thing. And they get called to the court to play it. And James doesn't like it. And I'm just thinking, oh, crikey. Okay, that's okay. Didn't hate it because it had witches in it. And, Shakespeare's obviously gone dipping in the Book of Demonology to get some correct witch facts in there. And he's sucked up to James. And James gone, oh, that's okay. But we know that Shakespeare got away with it because for the rest of the time he was alive, he was still sponsored by the king. And if the king had been that annoyed, he wouldn't have continued it. And I've recently found out a great fact. I was looking into the curse of Macbeth, and that the original Lady Macbeth died before the first performance. The actor playing Lady Macbeth died, and the only one that knew the words who could understudy was William Shakespeare. So William Shakespeare was the first Lady Macbeth.
I did not know that.
I know. I was like, that's brilliant. So you have to go into the palace, perform to the king your new sucky up play, and you have to play Lady Macbeth. Brilliant. I absolutely love that. So we have Macbeth being a kind of political kind of thing because he wants to kind of show his political allegiance. And I think James would have liked it because if you play Macbeth to an audience, your mass media, they're going to go, oh, yeah, so James is the true king of England. Right, got that. Okay. It would appease the masses. They would get their information from the plays of the day. And whatever they would see, they would take because they can't read it for themselves. They go on the kind of popularity of it. So you have lots of information being given to the people through the plays. If you think about, we've talked about the Roman plays, the difference between republic and monarchy. Then you look at the difference. Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth, the nature of monarchy. Macbeth usurps the throne. He isn't the heir, and he comes a cropper. Therefore, if you are the heir to the throne, that's the divine right. It comes through. You see different things coming through. Hamlet, the revenge tragedy. How do kings come about? Because technically, shouldn't Hamlet be king because he's the son? So again, that's playing on people's understanding of what politics is and what monarchy should be. So
we also have Richard. We also have Richard II too, because
Richard II.
Yeah,
I was saving that till last. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry about that. But I did want to. But I did want to ask another question because so I want to back up to how you mentioned that there were 4 major playwrights in London at that time. So so obviously in modern times when we think of English drama, we immediately default to Shakespeare, and because he's the prime example of what English theater is. But but we tend to forget that there were other writers out there, like Kit Marlowe, for instance, who wrote Jew of Malta, Dr. Faustus, Ben Jonson. He wrote Volpone, didn't he?
Yes.
Yes, and
so
then
Ben Jonson, yeah.
And then you got Robert Greene. So but in my mind, I'm thinking, I mean, these guys wrote some some equally good plays, and I'm fairly certain that they were just as just as incisive and just as political in their in their views as Shakespeare was. So why is it that we don't really put too much stock or hear too much from from these other 3 like we do with Shakespeare? Because I'm assuming Jew of Malta was just as controversial as, say, Othello, for instance.
So that's a really interesting question. I think at the time, if you look at, Ben Jonson, he was very controversial and became very got into a lot of trouble for some of the things that he was writing and some of the plays he was putting on. He did go to Cambridge, so he was one of the quote unquote elite. He was a war hero. He did actually fight on the continent, and he did um, he did like a drink. He did like a scuffle. But we've got evidence that says that Shakespeare wasn't. He wasn't a big drinker. He wasn't a big philanderist. He wasn't a big kind of party animal. Apparently, by all accounts, he was very boring.
Yeah, so
He was,
he's what we would call white bread.
yeah,
Basically.
vanilla. Yeah, exactly. He would just, sit in his room and write poetry. Like a kind of very sad teenage boy. But we've got Kit Marlowe being very flashy, being very, there's some people that says he was gay or at least bi, and he's very kind of open and flamboyant,
And he was a
and
spy, wasn't he?
a spy. The
Yeah.
original James Bond, 001, License to Thrill, just so whipped up controversy. And what we find is that Shakespeare didn't. He didn't whip up controversy. He was quiet. We don't hear about him. We get Robert Greene writing kind of big diatribes against Shakespeare. We get Ben Jonson being very, very controversial. We get Kit Marlowe being very, very controversial. And we get Shakespeare not. And I think it's because, and it's to kind of answer your kind of your question, I'm fumbling around a bit. I think it's because he wasn't controversial at the time. He just wrote the plays. I think Ben Jonson converted to Catholicism. He was a brawler as well. I think I read that he was arrested because he beat a man to death in a drunken stupor. Which is not good for one's career if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
And then you got
like with the guy Roman Polanski, for instance.
exactly, or there's controversial figures. What's that name of that rapper? Oh, R. Kelly or Chris Brown. It's not good for your career.
Yeah.
So you get also Robert Johnson. Sorry, not Robert Johnson. He's a blues guy. Ben Jonson converting to Catholicism in a time of Protestantism, not really kind of de rigueur. So you've got this very vanilla guy in the middle of all this, just writing plays, trying to keep up with people around him, but seemingly avoiding all controversy. You don't see him appear in the name of courtrooms. You don't see him being arrested for anything. There was, of course, questions about him, but we don't see any scandal attached to him. I think the only scandal that people kind of ascribe to Shakespeare is the fact that when he and his wife married, their daughter was born 3 months later. And that's the only kind of scandal that we can find, that it was a shotgun wedding. And by keeping his nose clean, we get that survival. And that, I think, is why he has kind of lasted so long, whereas the others kind of haven't. I mean, don't get me wrong. You got Faustus is a fantastic play. I love it. And you got Friar Bungay from Robert Greene, which is a hoot. It's really quite funny. And some of Ben Jonson's works as well. But they don't have the sticking power. They just don't seem to have had the same impact. And whether it's because Shakespeare was just a good boy and got his head down and just did his homework, maybe that's the case.
Yeah, so he didn't rock the boat too much.
No, exactly. I mean, we've kind of skirted around it a lot, but the only time where we get close to that scandal and that oh crikey moment is the delightful Robert Devereux, which we've mentioned a few times. And Robert Devereux,
we're finally getting to it.
here we go. We've teased enough. We've done enough spoilers, enough Easter eggs. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, who, if you look into him, he was. There's a character in British comedy cycles called Tim Nice but Dim. who was highly educated, private school boy, but was thick as two short planks. And this Essex was a lot of bluster, a lot of bravado, and not much going on upstairs. Um, he performed quote unquote military service, but wasn't that the effect very effectual.
Because he was in Ireland, didn't it? Wasn't he?
That was the big controversy. He
Okay.
basically blagged his way into being Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He talked himself into it. It was in the middle of the 9 Years' War, and no one had been successful, but he convinced everybody that he was the guy that was going to be successful. Spoiler alert, he wasn't.
So basically, he pulled a
And
Bojo, right?
he, yes, yeah, he convinced everybody. I have no idea how. And he needed more force to go and defeat the Irish, managed somehow to get 16,000 troops to end the rebellion. And the Queen wished him well on her way, and with 16,000 Englishmen, well trained professional soldiers, even an idiot could have just pointed them at the enemy and said, "Go on," and you should have won. But what he did was he had better ideas. He was convinced that he knew how to bring peace to Ireland, and it wasn't by defeating the rebellion in an open battle and therefore quashing it beyond all recognition. No, what he decided to do was little inconclusive kind of battles here, there, and everywhere, fortifications, and at the end he just ran out of money, did nothing, and ended up losing loads of battles. And he tried to create a truce with the leader, and ended up losing terms. It was actually detrimental terms. And there's a lovely quote that the Queen is supposed to have said to him, if I wanted to abandon Ireland, I wouldn't have sent you there. It would have just happened. So he kind of came back, and what he did was to kind of, before he came back, he knighted everybody under the name and authority of the Queen. So anyone that he thought was okay, he would knight. And by the end of his time in Ireland, it said that more than half the knights in England were knighted by him.
So sort of like if Richie Sunak decided to just make all of his mates lords without having to go through the king, right?
Yeah, exactly. And but thing is, what he believed was if he had loads of knights on his side, he would become really powerful because he was the god of these knights.
Now he wasn't aiming to try to be king, was he? Like
Not
he
at all.
just
Not
he was
at
just on a
all.
huge power trip.
He was on a huge power trip. So he came back. I mean, the lovely kind of the rebels, the Irish rebels, in typical Irish humour, said that the only time he ever drew his sword was to knight one of his mates, which I think is
I
quite nice, actually.
Yeah, I remember
It's quite
hearing
nice.
that.
Yeah, it's quite nice. But then again, he becomes like Chancellor of the University of Dublin. It's like, what are you doing? Again, it's that class system. You have enough power, influence, and money, you can kind of do what you want, really. But the way where he comes into the Shakespeare story was near the end of Queen Elizabeth's life, and um, she's old, she's not very well, she's on a deathbed kind of thing, and he decides this is the perfect time to form a coup, and he wants to kind of form a coup and overthrow her, and not become king himself, but kind of try to subvert the government. And to do this, what he does, one of the things is he remembers that Richard II, the Shakespeare play, talks about an aging monarch and the shift of power. So he pays Shakespeare's company, I think it's 40 guineas over their normal fee, to put Richard II on. And of
Like he
course,
really
Shakespeare.
he really really wanted that play to be put on if he's
Exactly.
forking out that much money.
And I think that was one of the saving graces for Shakespeare, because as a businessman, if someone goes, I'm going to give you 40 guineas over your usual play, put on that play. Okay. You don't ask, do you? You just go, okay, we'll put on that play, no problem. And it was Essex's hope that the people would see the play and that would incite them into rebellion. Turns out it didn't. Only 300 people turned up for his rebellion, and he was arrested and then executed for treason. This is Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, not Shakespeare.
Right.
And one of the evidence that the Crown used was that Shakespeare's company was summoned to court to play Richard II. So they had to go into the Queen's palace and do the play. And at the end, the Queen went, "Oh, that's quite a nice play." Nothing wrong with it, even though in her she's quoted as saying herself that she is Richard II. She actually, there's a kind of quotation that she says that she's like Richard II, which kind of plays into what she was doing. But I think she likes Shakespeare. I mean, he makes reference to her in some of the plays. There's the Oberon talks of a fair vestal thrown by the west. That's supposed to be Elizabeth. There's other bits and pieces where he mentions fairy queens. That's supposed to be Elizabeth. So he has a lot of time from Elizabeth. So
But
I think
but to go back to Devereaux, I mean there were a lot of episodes where Devereaux, was just being insubordinate to the Queen. Wasn't
yes.
I remember wasn't there an episode where they were in council and he turned his back on her and she boxed him in the ear, to try to reprimand him, and then and did he draw his or did he almost draw a sword on her as a result?
So I don't know about the boxing of the ear, but it wouldn't put me. I wouldn't surprise me. He just seems to be, from what I know of him, just an absolute douche. He seems to be just always trying to get one over, thinking he's more important. And I think that's kind of where we go. I do like the idea of him being boxed in the ears by the Queen, though. I think that's quite a nice.
I mean, because he is a hot. I mean, he's basically Percy from Henry the Fourth, just walking around acting too big for his britches, and the Queen kind of has to knock him down a peg, and he's like, well, who the hell are you to do that? But I mean,
They were
but
family,
it is against.
weren't they? Were they first cousins or first cousins
Yeah,
once removed or something?
I think so. Yeah, but I mean, but just the fact that he drew a sword against the Queen, that's an act of treason, isn't it?
Yeah, he should have been executed straight away. Lack of respect. Oh, there we go. I've just found it on my notes. During a heated Privy Council debate, the Queen cuffed an insolent Essex round the head, prompting him to draw his sword on her. So, yeah.
Well, there we go.
There we go. He took part in Drake's Armada as well. Crikey. So he's always there or thereabouts, but finally got his comeuppance and lost his head.
Yeah, because didn't she also take away his license? Because he had a license for, was it trading wine or something? And that made up a substantial amount of his income.
I don't know that one actually. That's. I mean, there's some aspects of this history that just I'm not too familiar. I'm familiar with a lot of it, but there's some of the interesting stories I'm not fully into. But I wouldn't put it past him. There's a lot of corruption in that era. There's a lot of kind of. I know that the privateer license, which gave eventually birth to the piracy, the great pirates of the Caribbean that we know, comes from Queen Elizabeth. You got Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake.
I mean Raleigh. I mean the capital of North Carolina. My state is named after Sir Walter Raleigh. So
is it really?
Yeah. I mean, remember, the Lost Colony is off the coast, and that's the famous incident of Virginia Dare, the first woman born in the Americas. But what I was getting at is that with all these, me mentioning all these incidents, it's not like Devereaux just decides one day I feel like I'm going to go and try to overthrow the Queen. It's the fact that you have all these all these I guess you could say isolated episodes kind of linked together where
the signs were there. The signs were there that he had no. I think being so close to the Queen in familial terms. We said before that there's loads of names of families that just seem to be ever present in the royal court. I think he's related to the Boleyns. I think it's his grandmother is a Boleyn, which makes him related to Elizabeth herself. So you get this kind of duty that I can do what I want because I'm related to the Queen. And at the time, again, we go back to the politics. The Queen's has that right that Parliament is a very strange being. Parliament seems to be at the King or Queen's whim. The King or Queen decides what they want to do, and then Parliament makes it happen with no kind of debate or comeback. And then
it doesn't become that independent force until after the Civil War.
That's the changing power of that monarchy after Charles I. So basically, you've got this kind of people in the Privy Council who give the Queen advice, and then she will go, right, okay, I want to enact this law, and they will pass that law. And it's a kind of sort of false democracy, really, because all the people in the Houses of Parliament were rich, dare I say it, white male landowners. And they're, of course, going to perpetuate their own claims. So Devereux seems to be a kind of person who likes that sense of power, likes that kind of money, likes to be able to do what he wants, and doesn't really have a lot of respect for other people, and has this belief that his power gives him status. He walks into the army to go and take over Ireland and has no idea what he's doing. Literally has no idea. Even the Queen's telling him, right, all you got to do is meet them in a pitched battle and you will win. And he goes, no, I know what I'm doing. So it's just this kind of farcical kind of
machismo kind of,
just this incident after incident. And then this seems to be the last straw, that he tries to whip up a kind of coup d'etat and fails.
So right now we're getting over an hour, so I do want to go ahead and just draw this to a close. But I will say this. I do want to do a part 2 of this discussion, because I think you and I can both agree we've barely scratched the surface of this conversation. And really, so for part 2, what I really want to get at, because and I've been hoping to discuss it today's episode, but we didn't get there. But I do want to discuss these plays as can we see them as cautionary tales or as political manuals? Because around that time, that's when you're starting to see works like Machiavelli's The Prince talking about what does it mean to be a monarch. And not to mention too, with, like I mentioned before, with the advent of the printing press, you're getting a proliferation of classical works by Seneca and Cicero, which talk about statecraft and what does it mean to be a statesman. So I feel like that in itself could be an entirely new episode. And honestly, Claire, I think we could do 6 parts to this discussion. Really.
Yeah, we'll do a sequel, then we'll do a prequel.
Exactly. So normally I ask my guests what their favorite movies or TV shows are at the end of the conversation, but because this is a conversation that we're going to continue later on, we'll probably save that for when we actually get to the true end of the conversation and not today. But I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch this episode, and we will return with a part 2 very soon. And we'll catch you on the flip side.